I never thought my own sister would forge documents to steal everything our grandmother left me. But when she did, she made one crucial mistake. She forgot that our mother sits on the federal bench.
I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in March. I remember the exact time because I was staring at my phone screen, wondering who could possibly be calling at such an ungodly hour. It was Rebecca Chen from the law firm handling my grandmother's estate. "Marcus, I'm so sorry to call this late, but there's been a development. We need to meet first thing tomorrow morning." My grandmother, Eleanor Whitman, had passed away 6 months earlier at the age of 89. She'd been the matriarch of our family, the one who held Sunday dinners together and remembered everyone's birthdays. More importantly, she'd been the one person who truly understood my dreams of becoming a documentary filmmaker. While everyone else in the family questioned my unstable career choice, Grandma Eleanor had been my biggest supporter. That's why it came as no surprise when Rebecca initially told me I was the primary beneficiary of Eleanor's estate. The house in Burlington, Vermont, a stunning Victorian worth nearly $800,000, along with her investment portfolio totaling just over $400,000, and her collection of antique jewelry that had been appraised at $60,000. It was more money than I'd ever dreamed of having, and it meant I could finally quit my job at the insurance company and focus full-time on my film projects. My sister Vanessa had inherited $25,000 and some personal items. At the time, she'd seemed genuinely happy for me, congratulating me with what appeared to be sincere warmth. "Grandma always loved your creative spirit," she'd said, hugging me tightly at the funeral reception. "She knew you'd do something amazing with this opportunity." I should have known better. Vanessa had always been the golden child. Harvard law graduate, successful corporate attorney, married to a neurosurgeon. She lived in a sprawling house in Westchester County and drove a BMW that cost more than most people's annual salary. But apparently, that wasn't enough. When I arrived at Rebecca's office that Wednesday morning, I could tell immediately that something was very wrong. She looked like she hadn't slept, and there were several thick folders spread across her usually pristine desk. "Marcus, please sit down. This is going to be difficult to hear." She slid a document across the desk toward me. It was a will, apparently my grandmother's will, but as I read through it, my blood ran cold. According to this version, Vanessa was to inherit the house and the majority of the investment portfolio. I was left with just $50,000 and some of Eleanor's books. "This can't be right," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You showed me the original will 6 months ago. I'm supposed to inherit the house and the investments." Rebecca's expression was grim. That's what we thought too. But yesterday, Vanessa's legal team presented us with this document, claiming it's a more recent will dated just 2 weeks before your grandmother's death. They have 2 witnesses and what appears to be your grandmother's signature. I stared at the signature. It looked like Eleanor's handwriting, but something felt off about it. The loops were slightly different and the pressure seemed uneven. How is this possible? Grandma never mentioned changing her will. And she was barely conscious those last 2 weeks. She was on heavy pain medication. "I know this is shocking, Marcus. We're going to have our handwriting experts examine both documents, but Vanessa's team is pushing for immediate probate based on this newer will. They claim the previous will was just a draft that was never properly executed." Over the next several days, I felt like I was living in a nightmare. Vanessa wasn't returning my phone calls or text messages. When I finally drove to her house in Westchester, her husband Derek answered the door and told me she was dealing with family legal matters and couldn't speak with me. "This is ridiculous, Derek. She's my sister. What family legal matters could she possibly be dealing with that don't involve me?" Derek, usually friendly and talkative, barely made eye contact. "I'm sorry, Marcus. She'll reach out when she's ready." The door closed in my face, leaving me standing on the marble steps of their grand entrance, feeling more alone than I ever had in my life. I tried reaching out to other family members, but the responses were strange and evasive. My cousin Jennifer said she didn't want to get involved in family drama. My Uncle Robert claimed he hadn't heard anything about a second will, but trusted that everything would work out fairly. It was as if everyone had suddenly developed amnesia about the fact that Eleanor had always made it crystal clear that she wanted me to inherit the bulk of her estate. Meanwhile, Vanessa's legal team was moving fast. They filed motion after motion, claiming that any delay in probate was causing unnecessary financial burden to the estate. Rebecca did her best to slow things down, requesting extensions for the handwriting analysis, but it felt like we were fighting a losing battle. The worst part was the doubt that started creeping into my mind. What if I was wrong? What if Eleanor really had changed her mind in those final weeks? Maybe the pain medication had made her lucid enough to reconsider? Maybe she'd decided that Vanessa, with her stable career and family, was better equipped to handle such a large inheritance. But then I remembered the conversation I'd had with Eleanor just 3 weeks before she died. I'd been visiting her in the hospital, and she'd grabbed my hand with surprising strength. "Promise me something, Marcus," she'd whispered. "Promise me you won't let anyone talk you out of your dreams. The house is going to be yours, and I want you to use it as your base while you build your film career. Don't let anyone convince you that practical is always better than passionate." That conversation had been witnessed by her day nurse, a kind woman named Patricia Williams, who'd worked with Eleanor for nearly 2 years. When I called Patricia to ask if she remembered that conversation, her response sent chills down my spine. "Oh, honey, yes, I remember that day very clearly. Your grandmother was so worried about making sure you knew how proud she was of you. But Marcus, there's something else you should know. About a week after that conversation, your sister came to visit. She spent nearly 3 hours alone with your grandmother, and when I came back from my break, your grandmother seemed very upset and confused. She kept asking me if she'd signed some papers and couldn't remember what they were for." Patricia paused, and I could hear her taking a deep breath on the other end of the line. "I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but your sister asked me a lot of questions about your grandmother's mental state those last few weeks. She wanted to know specific details about the medication schedule and whether your grandmother was ever confused or disoriented. At the time, I thought she was just being a concerned daughter, but now what, Patricia? Now I'm wondering if she was gathering information for some other purpose."
After that phone call, I knew with absolute certainty that something was very wrong. But knowing it and proving it were two completely different things. Vanessa had covered her tracks well, and her legal team was composed of some of the best estate attorneys in New York. They had resources I couldn't possibly match on my insurance adjuster salary. That's when I realized I had one advantage that Vanessa might not have considered. Our mother, Judge Catherine Morrison, had been appointed to the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York 3 years earlier. She'd built her career on being absolutely incorruptible and having zero tolerance for any kind of fraud or deception, even when it involved family. The problem with having a federal judge for a mother is that you can't just call her up crying about family drama. Judge Catherine Morrison had always made it clear that her professional life and personal life were completely separate. She'd built her reputation on being fair, methodical, and absolutely immune to emotional manipulation, even from her own children. Still, I found myself sitting in my car outside the federal courthouse in Manhattan, staring up at the imposing building where my mother spent her days. I'd been there for 20 minutes, trying to work up the courage to go inside. What was I supposed to say? "Hi, Mom, I think Vanessa forged Grandma's will, and I need you to fix it?" Finally, I called her chambers and asked her secretary if Judge Morrison had any time to see me. Margaret, who'd worked for my mother for over a decade, told me she could squeeze me in during her lunch break. When I walked into her chambers, Mom was reviewing case files with her usual laser focus. She looked up over her reading glasses, the same stern expression she'd worn when I was 12 and had broken her favorite vase. "Marcus, this is unexpected. Is everything all right?" I sat down across from her massive mahogany desk, feeling suddenly like a child again. "Mom, I need to ask you something about Grandma's will, and I need you to hear me out before you say anything." Her expression didn't change, but I saw her set down her pen. "Go ahead." I told her everything: the original will, the mysterious second document, Patricia's phone call, Vanessa's strange behavior, the rushed probate proceedings. My mother listened without interruption, her face giving away nothing. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a small recording device.
I'm going to ask you to repeat everything you just told me, but this time I want you to be very specific about dates, times, and exactly what each person said to you. Can you do that? Mom, why are you recording this? Because if what you're telling me is true, we're not just talking about a family dispute. We're talking about forgery, elder abuse, and fraud. These are federal crimes, Marcus. The weight of her words hit me like a freight train. I'd been so focused on the injustice of losing my inheritance that I hadn't fully grasped the criminal implications of what Vanessa had allegedly done. Over the next hour, my mother grilled me like I was a witness in one of her trials. She wanted exact quotes, specific times, details about Eleanor's mental state, everything I could remember about my interactions with Rebecca and the various family members. By the time we were done, I felt emotionally drained, but oddly relieved. For the first time in weeks, someone was taking my concerns seriously. I need to make something very clear, Marcus, she said when we finished. If I pursue this, I'm not doing it as your mother. I'm doing it as an officer of the court who has reason to believe that crimes may have been committed. That means I can't promise you any particular outcome, and I can't give you legal advice about the inheritance. Do you understand?
A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I fully grasped what she meant. Good. Now, I want you to go home and document everything we discussed today while it's fresh in your memory. Write down every conversation, every phone call, every interaction you've had related to this will. I'm going to make some calls. 3 days later, my phone rang. It was Rebecca, and she sounded different, nervous, almost excited. Marcus, something very interesting has happened. The FBI just contacted our office. They want to examine both wills as part of a federal investigation into potential estate fraud. My heart started pounding. The FBI? How did they? I can't get into details, but apparently someone with significant legal authority referred this case to them. They're treating it as a potential organized fraud scheme targeting elderly individuals. Within a week, everything changed. Federal agents interviewed Patricia Williams, who provided detailed testimony about Vanessa's suspicious visits and questions about Eleanor's mental state. They examined security footage from the hospital and found evidence that Vanessa had been alone with Eleanor for extended periods during times when the elderly woman was heavily medicated. Most damning of all, the FBI's forensic handwriting experts concluded that while Eleanor's signature on the second will appeared authentic at first glance, it had actually been traced from her signature on other documents. The pressure patterns and microscopic ink flow were completely inconsistent with natural handwriting. But the real breakthrough came when agents obtained a warrant to search Vanessa's home computer. Hidden in her deleted files, they found draft versions of the fraudulent will, complete with notes about how to make the handwriting look more authentic. There were also email exchanges with a private investigator she'd hired to research Eleanor's assets and daily routine at the care facility. The scope of Vanessa's scheme was breathtaking. She'd been planning this for months, carefully studying Eleanor's handwriting, learning her medication schedule, and even researching the legal requirements for will witnesses in Vermont. She'd recruited 2 people, acquaintances from her gym, to pose as witnesses, paying them each $5,000 and coaching them on what to say if anyone questioned the document's authenticity. When the FBI arrested Vanessa at her law office on a Tuesday morning, the local news picked up the story. "Prominent attorney charged with elder fraud and forgery," the headlines read. Derek called me that evening, his voice shaking. "Marcus, I had no idea. I swear to you, I had no idea what she was doing. She told me the family had agreed to split the inheritance differently, that you were okay with the arrangement." I almost felt sorry for him. Derek was a brilliant surgeon, but had always been somewhat naive when it came to anything outside his medical expertise. The idea that his wife could orchestrate such an elaborate fraud had clearly never crossed his mind. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following month. Vanessa's defense attorney, ironically one of the top white-collar crime lawyers in the city, tried to argue that this was simply a family dispute over a will's authenticity, not a federal crime.
but the evidence was overwhelming. The forged signatures, the deleted computer files, the paid witnesses, the private investigator, it painted a picture of premeditated fraud that went far beyond a simple disagreement over inheritance. What made it even worse was the discovery that Eleanor wasn't Vanessa's first target. The FBI investigation uncovered evidence that she'd been involved in similar schemes with two other elderly clients whose estates she'd handled through her law firm. She'd used her legal expertise and professional credentials to gain these people's trust, then manipulated them into changing their wills in ways that benefited her associates, who would then share the proceeds with her. This was her business model, a sophisticated, long-term fraud operation that had been generating illegal income for nearly 3 years. The estimated total amount stolen was over $2 million. My mother, true to her word, had approached this purely as a matter of law enforcement. She never once mentioned the family connection in any of her communications with the FBI or the U.S. Attorney's Office. In fact, she'd recused herself from any potential involvement in the case once it entered the federal system. But I knew she was the reason this was happening so quickly and thoroughly. Her referral had given the case priority and credibility that it never would have had if I'd just been some random person claiming his sister had forged a will. As the evidence mounted, I felt a strange mix of vindication and sadness. I'd been right about the fraud, but discovering the extent of Vanessa's crimes was devastating. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment or a desperate act. It was a calculated, ongoing criminal enterprise that had destroyed multiple families. The courtroom was packed the day Vanessa's trial began. I'd never seen so many reporters and spectators for what I'd initially thought was just a family matter. But Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Chen had made it clear that this case was about much more than my grandmother's will. It was about protecting vulnerable elderly people from predatory schemes. Vanessa walked into the courtroom wearing a navy blue suit, her hair pulled back in the same professional style she'd worn since law school. For a moment, she looked exactly like the successful attorney she'd been just 6 months ago. But when her eyes met mine across the courtroom, I saw something I'd never seen before: genuine fear. Her legal team had tried everything to get the charges reduced or dismissed. They argued that the government was overreaching, that this was a civil matter blown out of proportion. They even attempted to claim that Eleanor had actually wanted to change her will, but was too confused to execute it properly, so Vanessa had helped by creating the document Eleanor intended. The prosecution methodically dismantled every defense argument. They presented the forensic evidence showing the traced signatures, the computer files proving premeditation, and testimony from the private investigator Vanessa had hired. But the most powerful moment came when Patricia Williams took the stand. Patricia, dressed in her crisp white nursing uniform, spoke quietly but clearly about Eleanor's final weeks. She described how confused and upset Eleanor had been after Vanessa's long visits, how she'd repeatedly asked about papers she might have signed, and how she'd worried about making sure Marcus gets what I promised him. Mrs. Whitman was very specific about her wishes, Patricia testified. She told me multiple times that she wanted Marcus to have the house so he could pursue his filmmaking dreams. She said it was the most important thing she could do for him. Under cross-examination, Vanessa's attorney tried to suggest that Patricia's memory might be faulty or that she was biased toward me. But Patricia had kept detailed nursing notes, and her records corroborated every conversation she described. The trial lasted 2 weeks. I attended every day, watching my sister's life unravel in real time. The most shocking revelation came when prosecutors called Detective Lisa Rodriguez from the NYPD's Financial Crimes Division. She'd been investigating the other victims in Vanessa's fraud scheme, and her testimony painted a picture of systematic exploitation that made me sick to my stomach. There was Harold Brennan, an 83-year-old retired professor whose children discovered after his death that he'd supposedly left his entire estate to a charity that didn't exist, a charity that Vanessa had created on paper and controlled through shell companies. The real beneficiaries, Harold's 2 daughters, received nothing. Then there was Margaret Stokes, a widow who changed her will just days before entering hospice care, leaving her valuable art collection to Vanessa's law firm instead of the museum she'd supported for decades. Margaret's nephew had tried to contest the will but lacked the resources to fight Vanessa's legal team. Both cases followed the same pattern: elderly clients with substantial assets, periods of confusion or medication that affected their judgment, and wills that were technically legal but completely contrary to the victim's established wishes and relationships. What made it even more disturbing was how Vanessa had used her position as a respected attorney to legitimize these fraudulent documents. Other lawyers, court clerks, and even judges had processed these wills without question because they came from Vanessa Morrison, Harvard Law graduate and daughter of a federal judge. The prosecution estimated that Vanessa's total proceeds from the scheme exceeded $2.8 million. She'd hidden the money in offshore accounts and cryptocurrency, planning for what prosecutors called a sophisticated financial exit strategy. During the defense's case, Vanessa's attorney painted her as a woman under enormous pressure: student loans, a mortgage on an expensive house, pressure to maintain a lifestyle befitting her professional status. They brought in character witnesses who described her charitable work and community involvement, trying to portray the fraud as completely out of character. But the most uncomfortable moment for our entire family came when Derek took the stand as a character witness. He described Vanessa as a loving wife and stepmother, someone who'd always been generous and ethical. But under cross-examination, Assistant U.S. Attorney Chen forced him to admit that Vanessa had hidden their family's dire financial situation from him. "Dr. Morrison, were you aware that your wife had accumulated over $400,000 in credit card debt?" Derek's face went white. "No, I was not." "Were you aware that she'd taken out a second mortgage on your home without your knowledge?" "No." "Were you aware that she'd been moving money from your joint medical practice account into her personal accounts?" Derek's voice was barely a whisper. "No, I was not aware of any of that." The financial evidence showed that despite their outwardly successful lifestyle, Vanessa had been drowning in debt for years. She'd been using credit cards to pay other credit cards, borrowing against Derek's medical practice, and even taking loans against her law firm's operating account. The elderly fraud scheme hadn't been motivated by simple greed. It had been a desperate attempt to avoid financial collapse. But perhaps the most damaging testimony came from Amanda Foster, one of the fake witnesses Vanessa had paid to sign Eleanor's fraudulent will. Amanda, a personal trainer at Vanessa's gym, had been granted immunity in exchange for her testimony. "She approached me about 6 months before Mrs. Whitman died," Amanda testified. "She said she had a client who needed witnesses for some legal documents, and she'd pay me $5,000 to sign some papers and be available to testify if needed." "Did she tell you what you were signing?" "She said it was just routine estate planning stuff. She gave me a script of what to say if anyone asked about the signing, told me the old lady was a little confused but knew what she wanted. She made it seem like I was helping an elderly person get her affairs in order." Amanda's voice cracked as she continued. "If I'd known I was helping steal from someone's grandson, I never would have done it. She made it sound completely legitimate." The jury deliberated for just 4 hours. When they returned with guilty verdicts on all counts, elder fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy, Vanessa collapsed into her chair. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, she looked like the sister I'd grown up with, not the calculating criminal she'd become. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following month, but the conviction meant that Eleanor's original will was immediately reinstated. Rebecca called me that evening with news I'd been waiting almost a year to hear. "Marcus, the court has validated your grandmother's original will. The house in Vermont, the investment accounts, the jewelry, it's all yours, just as Eleanor intended." But sitting in my apartment that night, looking at the legal documents that restored my inheritance, I felt hollow rather than triumphant. I'd gotten back what was rightfully mine, but I'd also discovered that my sister was capable of destroying multiple families for money. The victory felt tainted by the knowledge of how much damage Vanessa had done to innocent people. The media coverage intensified after the conviction. Federal judge's daughter convicted in elder fraud scheme dominated the legal news for weeks. My mother maintained her professional silence, but I could see the toll it was taking on her. She'd built her entire career on integrity and justice, and now her family name was associated with one of the most elaborate elder fraud cases the district had seen. 3 weeks later, I received an unexpected phone call from Derek. His voice was different, older, sadder. "Marcus, I know this is difficult, but Vanessa wants to see you before the sentencing. She's been asking every day if you'll come to jail." I'd been dreading this moment, but I also knew I couldn't move forward without facing her one last time. The federal detention center in Brooklyn was nothing like the polished law offices and courtrooms where Vanessa had spent her career. The waiting room smelled of industrial disinfectant and desperation, filled with families clutching visitor passes and speaking in hushed, worried tones. I'd been sitting there for 40 minutes, second-guessing my decision to come. What could Vanessa possibly say that would make any of this better? What did I expect from this conversation? An apology? An explanation? Some kind of closure that would magically heal the destruction she'd caused? When they finally called my name, I was led through a series of security checkpoints to a small, sterile room with a metal table and 2 plastic chairs. Vanessa was already waiting, wearing an orange jumpsuit that made her look smaller somehow, more vulnerable than I'd ever seen her. Her hair had grown out from its usual professional cut, and she'd lost weight. But it was her eyes that shocked me most. They looked haunted, like she hadn't slept properly in months. "Marcus," her voice was barely above a whisper. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." I sat down across from her, keeping the metal table between us. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Vanessa began to cry. Not the controlled, dignified tears I'd seen her shed at Eleanor's funeral, but raw, desperate sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. "I'm so sorry," she said through her tears. "Marcus, I'm so incredibly sorry for what I did to you, to Grandma's memory, to those other families. I know sorry isn't enough, but I need you to know that I hate myself for what I became." "Why, Vanessa? That's all I want to understand. Why did you do it?" She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to compose herself. "It started small. Just one client whose will seemed unfair, a bitter old man who was cutting his only daughter out of his inheritance over some trivial argument. I thought I was Robin Hood, fixing an injustice. That's not what this was about with Grandma."
"No," her voice cracked. "By the time I got to Grandma, it had become something else entirely. Derek and I were drowning financially. The house, the cars, the private schools for his kids from his first marriage, we were living completely beyond our means, and I was too proud to admit it to anyone." She stared at her hands, clasped tightly on the metal table. "You remember how Dad always said I was the responsible one, the one who had everything figured out? I couldn't bear the thought of admitting that I'd failed, that the perfect life everyone thought I had was actually falling apart. So you decided to steal from your own grandmother?" I told myself it was temporary. I convinced myself that I'd find a way to pay you back later, that maybe I could even give you more than what Grandma originally left you once I got my finances sorted out. But then the investigation started, and I realized how deep I'd gotten myself then. Vanessa looked up at me, and I saw something I'd never seen in her eyes before: complete vulnerability. The worst part is that I actually believed my own lies. I started thinking that maybe Grandma would have wanted me to have the inheritance, because I was the one with a stable family, with responsibilities. I rewrote history in my mind to make myself the victim instead of the perpetrator. What about Harold Brennan, Margaret Stokes? What about their families? Her face crumpled again. Those cases, they were different. By then, I wasn't thinking about right or wrong anymore. I was just trying to keep from losing everything. Each new scheme was supposed to be the last one, the one that would finally solve all my problems. But it never was enough, was it? No, it was like an addiction. Every time I successfully manipulated a will or moved money through one of my shell companies, I felt this rush of power and relief. But then the bills would come due again, or Derek would want to take another expensive vacation, and I'd need more. She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. The private investigator I hired to research Grandma's routine, do you know what he told me when I first approached him? I shook my head. He said that what I was describing sounded like elder abuse, and he wouldn't be part of it. So I lied to him too. I told him I suspected Grandma was being taken advantage of by someone else, and I needed to document her mental state to protect her. I turned him into an unwitting accomplice by making him think he was helping prevent the exact crime I was planning to commit. The manipulation extended even further than I'd realized. Vanessa hadn't just stolen from elderly victims, she'd corrupted everyone around her, turning well-meaning professionals into tools for her schemes. "There's something else you need to know," she said quietly. "About Mom." My stomach dropped. "What about Mom?" "She knew something was wrong months before you came to her. She'd been asking me strange questions about my finances, my caseload, whether I was handling everything okay. I think she suspected I was in trouble, but she never imagined the scope of what I was doing. This revelation hit me like a physical blow. My mother, with her decades of legal experience and finely tuned instincts for detecting deception, had sensed something was off with Vanessa long before any of us realized the extent of the fraud. "That's why she was so thorough when you brought your concerns to her," Vanessa continued. "She wasn't just investigating your claims, she was finally getting answers to suspicions she'd been harboring for months." I thought back to that day in my mother's chambers, how quickly she'd moved from listening to recording my testimony. At the time, I'd attributed it to her professional nature, but now I understood that she'd been waiting for confirmation of fears she'd already been wrestling with. "Does she know that you know she suspected?" "I think so. She came to see me after the conviction, before the media really picked up the story. She didn't say much, just that she was sorry things had gotten to this point, and that she hoped I could eventually find a way to make amends for what I'd done. That must have been difficult. It was the worst conversation of my life. Worse than the guilty verdict, worse than Derek finding out about the hidden debts. She looked at me like I was a stranger, like she couldn't reconcile the daughter she'd raised with the person sitting across from her." Vanessa took a shaky breath. "But she also said something that I keep thinking about. She told me that justice isn't about punishment, it's about acknowledging harm and trying to repair what can be repaired. She said that my sentence, whatever it turns out to be, is just the beginning of that process." What did she mean? The restitution, for one thing. Every penny I stole has to be paid back to the victims' families, with interest. My share of the house in Westchester is being sold, Derek's retirement accounts are being liquidated, even my law license and my share of the firm are being converted to cash for the restitution fund. This was the first I'd heard about the financial consequences of Vanessa's crimes. The prosecution had focused on the criminal charges, but the civil implications were apparently just as devastating. Derek is going to lose everything? Everything we owned together, yes. The house, the cars, the investments, all of it. He's had to declare bankruptcy and move in with his parents. His kids' college funds are gone. His medical practice is struggling because patients don't want to be associated with the scandal. The collateral damage kept expanding. Derek hadn't committed any crimes, but Vanessa's actions had destroyed his life just as thoroughly as they'd destroyed her victims' families. "I know this doesn't change anything," Vanessa said, "but I want you to know that I'm grateful it was you who exposed me. If it had been anyone else, I might have found a way to keep going, to hurt even more people. At least this way, the damage stops here." We sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, I asked the question that had been haunting me since her arrest. "Do you think Grandma knew? In those final weeks, when you were manipulating her, do you think she understood what you were doing?" Vanessa's face went very still. "I think she knew something was wrong. She kept looking at me with this confused, disappointed expression, like she was trying to figure out why I was pressuring her about legal documents when she was dying." She paused, then continued in a voice so quiet I had to lean forward to hear her. "The last thing she said to me was, 'Vanessa, honey, I hope you remember that love isn't something you can inherit or steal. It's something you earn by being worthy of it.' At the time, I thought she was just rambling because of the medication, but now you think she knew exactly what she was saying. I think she knew exactly what I was becoming, and she was trying to save me from myself, but I was too far gone to hear her." The sentencing hearing took place on a gray October morning. exactly 13 months after Eleanor's death. Judge William Harper's courtroom was packed with victims' families, reporters, and legal observers who'd been following the case. I sat in the third row, directly behind the prosecution table, with Derek beside me, an unlikely alliance born from shared devastation.
Vanessa's sentencing memo had argued for leniency based on her cooperation with investigators and the complete financial restitution she was making. But Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Chen had filed a response detailing the psychological harm inflicted on elderly victims and their families, calling for a sentence that would deter other professionals from exploiting their positions of trust. Judge Harper was known for his lengthy, thoughtful sentencing statements. As Vanessa stood before him in her navy suit, the same one she'd worn throughout the trial, he spent nearly 20 minutes reviewing the evidence and the impact statements submitted by victims' families. "Miss Morrison," he finally said, "you violated the most fundamental trust that exists in our legal system. Clients came to you seeking protection for their life's work and their family legacies. Instead, you systematically betrayed that trust for personal financial gain." He paused, looking directly at her. "What makes this case particularly disturbing is not just the financial harm you caused, but the way you weaponized your legal expertise and family connections to legitimize your criminal activity. You didn't just steal money, you corrupted the very institutions designed to protect vulnerable people." The judge sentenced Vanessa to 8 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. Additionally, she was permanently disbarred and ordered to pay $3.2 million in restitution, an amount that included interest and penalties on top of the original stolen funds. As the bailiff led Vanessa away, she turned back toward the gallery. Her eyes found mine for just a moment, and I saw her mouth the words, "I'm sorry," one last time before disappearing through the side door. After the hearing, I walked outside into the crisp autumn air, feeling strangely empty. Derek caught up with me on the courthouse steps. "Marcus, I know this has been hell for both of us," he said, "but I want you to know that I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure those other victims' families get every penny they're owed, even if it means I never rebuild my own financial life." Derek had become an unexpected ally in the restitution process. Despite being legally entitled to claim some assets as an innocent spouse, he'd voluntarily surrendered everything to maximize the funds available for victim compensation. It was a level of integrity that reminded me why Vanessa had fallen in love with him in the first place. 3 weeks later, I found myself standing in the driveway of Eleanor's house in Burlington, holding the keys that Rebecca had finally been able to transfer to me. The Victorian looked exactly as it had during my childhood visits: cream-colored siding, wrap-around porch, maple trees turning brilliant red and gold in the front yard. But walking through the rooms felt different now. Eleanor's furniture was still there, covered in dust shoots. Her books still lined the shelves in perfect order. Yet the house felt haunted, not by her memory, by everything that had happened since her death. I spent my first night there going through Eleanor's personal papers, trying to understand her final months. In her bedroom dresser, I found a leather journal she'd kept during her last year. Most entries were mundane: doctor's appointments, visits from family, observations about the changing seasons. But one entry, dated just 3 weeks before her death, made me sit down hard on her bed. "Marcus came to visit today. He looks tired but hopeful about his film projects. I told him about the inheritance again because I want him to know how proud I am of his courage to pursue his dreams. Vanessa seems troubled lately, asking strange questions about my health and my legal affairs. I hope she's not feeling guilty about getting less than Marcus. Love isn't measured in dollars, and I pray both my grandchildren understand that someday." Eleanor had known. Maybe not the specific details of Vanessa's plan, but she'd sensed something was wrong. Her final conversations with me hadn't just been about sharing her wishes. They'd been her way of creating witnesses to protect those wishes. Over the following months, I threw myself into converting part of the house into a film studio. Using Eleanor's investment money wisely, I set up editing equipment in what used to be her sewing room and transformed the basement into a sound studio. The documentary I'd been dreaming about for years, a film about elderly people sharing their life stories, finally began to take shape. The irony wasn't lost on me. Eleanor's inheritance, which Vanessa had tried to steal, was enabling me to create exactly the kind of project that honored elderly voices and experiences. In a way, Eleanor was still protecting vulnerable people. I also started volunteering with the National Adult Protective Services Association, helping them develop educational materials about financial exploitation. My experience with Vanessa's case had taught me that elder fraud was far more sophisticated and widespread than most people realized. During one of these volunteer sessions, I met Helen Caldwell, Harold Brennan's daughter. She'd driven up from Boston specifically to meet me after learning about my involvement in exposing Vanessa's crimes. "I wanted to thank you," she said, as we sat in a coffee shop near the NAPSA offices. "If you hadn't pursued your grandmother's case, we never would have known what really happened to my father's estate. We thought he'd just lost his mind in his final weeks and made a crazy decision to leave everything to some charity we'd never heard of." Helen told me that the restitution process had recovered about 60% of her father's stolen assets. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to establish the scholarship fund Harold had actually wanted to create, a program supporting first-generation college students studying literature. "The money matters," she said, "but what matters more is knowing that my father didn't betray our family in his final days. Knowing that he was victimized, not vindictive, that gives us back our memories of who he really was." As months passed, I began receiving updates on Vanessa's situation through Derek, who visited her regularly. Prison had been a harsh adjustment for someone accustomed to designer suits and corner offices. She'd been assigned to work in the prison library, helping other inmates with legal research and appeals. "She's different," Derek told me during one of our occasional phone calls, "quieter, more reflective. She spends most of her time reading and writing letters to the victims' families, not asking for forgiveness, just acknowledging the harm she caused and providing information that might help with asset recovery." Some of those letters had made their way to me through the restitution attorneys. Vanessa's letter was 3 pages of meticulous detail about hidden accounts and shell companies, information that helped investigators recover an additional $200,000 for victim compensation. At the bottom, she'd written, "Marcus, I know I can never undo the damage I caused to our family or to the people I victimized, but I hope that providing this information is at least a first step toward the kind of repair that Mom talked about. Eleanor deserved better from both of us. I'm sorry it took losing everything for me to remember what she taught us about integrity." The final piece of closure came unexpectedly, almost 2 years after Vanessa's sentencing. I was editing my documentary in Eleanor's former sewing room when the phone rang. It was my mother, calling to tell me that the federal appeals court had just upheld Vanessa's conviction and sentence. "It's over," she said simply. "All the legal proceedings are finished." But then she said something that surprised me. "Marcus, I want you to know that what you did, coming to me with your concerns about the will, that was exactly what Eleanor would have wanted. She raised us all to believe that justice matters more than family loyalty when someone is being harmed."
Mom, do you think we'll ever be able to have a normal family again? She was quiet for a long moment. "I think we're going to have to define what normal means for us now. Vanessa made choices that changed everything, but that doesn't mean the rest of us have to let those choices define our futures." 6 months later, I premiered my documentary at the Burlington Film Festival. Voices of Wisdom, Life Stories from Vermont Elders featured interviews with 12 elderly residents sharing their experiences, dreams, and reflections on aging with dignity. Eleanor would have loved it. In the credits, I included a dedication for Eleanor Whitman, who taught me that the most valuable inheritance is the courage to do what's right, even when it's difficult. Derek attended the premiere, along with my mother and several of the documentary's subjects. Afterward, as we stood outside the theater under the autumn stars, Derek pulled me aside. "Vanessa asked me to tell you something," he said. "She watched the trailer online from prison. She wanted you to know that Eleanor would be proud of what you've built with her gift." Today, 3 years after Eleanor's death, I'm still living in her house, still making films, still working with elder advocacy groups. The inheritance that nearly destroyed our family has become the foundation for work that actually honors Eleanor's memory. Vanessa has 4 more years left on her sentence. She writes to me occasionally, updates on her prison book club, reflections on cases she's helping other inmates with, sometimes just memories of our childhood with Eleanor. I don't always write back, but I read every letter. Because ultimately, Eleanor was right about love not being something you can inherit or steal. It's something you earn by being worthy of it. And while Vanessa lost that worthiness for a time, I believe she's slowly earning it back, one honest letter and one day of accountability at a time. The inheritance she tried to steal ended up teaching us all what true inheritance really means. not money or property, but the values and principles we choose to carry forward. Eleanor's real legacy isn't the Victorian house or the investment accounts. It's the reminder that integrity matters more than comfort, and that protecting vulnerable people is worth any personal cost. In the end, that's the inheritance no one can ever steal. 5 years have passed since that October morning when Vanessa was sentenced, and the ripple effects of her crimes continue to reshape lives in ways none of us could have anticipated. What began as a family dispute over an inheritance has evolved into something much larger, a catalyst for legal reform, personal transformation, and unexpected connections that span across multiple states. Last month, I received a call from Professor Janet Morrison at Vermont Law School, no relation to our family, despite the shared surname. She was organizing a symposium on elder financial abuse and wanted me to speak about the victim's perspective. When I agreed, I had no idea it would reconnect me with people whose lives had intersected with ours in the most unlikely ways. The symposium was held at the law school's gleaming conference center, with attorneys, social workers, and policymakers from across New England. As I waited backstage, reviewing my notes about Eleanor's case and the documentary work that followed, I noticed a familiar name on the program: Dr. Amanda Chen, presenting on Medical Professional Recognition of Financial Exploitation. It was the same Amanda who had been Vanessa's unwitting accomplice at the gym, the personal trainer who'd been paid to sign fraudulent witness documents. But the woman who took the stage was dramatically different from the nervous, guilt-ridden person who testified at Vanessa's trial. Dr. Chen, she'd completed a PhD in geriatric psychology during the year since the trial, spoke with authority about the subtle signs of financial manipulation that healthcare workers often miss. 5 years ago, she told the audience, I was complicit in elder fraud without even knowing it. That experience taught me that good intentions aren't enough when you're dealing with sophisticated predators. We need systems, training, and protocols that protect vulnerable people from exploitation. After her presentation, Amanda approached me in the lobby. She looked confident and purposeful in her professional attire, a far cry from the shaken young woman I remembered from the courthouse. Marcus, I've been hoping to run into you someday, she said. What happened with your sister changed the entire trajectory of my life. After the trial, I couldn't stop thinking about how easily I'd been manipulated into hurting people. It made me realize how many other professionals might be unwittingly enabling these crimes. Amanda had used the guilt from her involvement in Vanessa's scheme as motivation to completely rebuild her career. She'd gone back to school, earned advanced degrees in psychology and gerontology, and now ran a consulting firm that trains healthcare facilities to recognize and prevent financial exploitation. I've developed screening protocols that have helped identify over 200 cases of suspected elder abuse in the past 3 years, she continued. In a strange way, your sister's crime taught me what my real calling was supposed to be. Her story was one of redemption through purpose, a theme I'd encountered repeatedly in the aftermath of Vanessa's crimes. People who had been touched by the case, witnesses, investigators, even some of the attorneys, had found themselves drawn to elder advocacy work in ways that seemed to honor the victim's suffering by preventing future harm. During my own presentation, I shared not just Eleanor's story, but the stories of Harold Brennan and Margaret Stokes, whose families had become part of an extended network of fraud survivors. We'd stayed in touch over the years, sharing resources and supporting each other through the long process of legal recovery and emotional healing. Helen Caldwell, Harold's daughter, had used her father's recovered inheritance to establish the Brennan Institute for Elder Justice, a nonprofit organization that provided legal assistance to families dealing with suspected financial exploitation. Margaret Stokes' nephew, Thomas, had become a forensic accountant specializing in estate fraud cases, using skills developed while trying to trace his aunt's stolen assets. What we learned, I told the symposium audience, is that recovering the money is often the least important part of healing from this kind of crime. What matters more is restoring the dignity of the victims and ensuring their true wishes are honored. In the question and answer session that followed, a young attorney raised her hand. Mr. Morrison, has your family been able to maintain any relationship with your sister during her incarceration? It was a question I'd been expecting, but still found difficult to answer. The truth was complicated and had evolved significantly over the 5 years since Vanessa's sentencing. For the first 2 years, our communication was minimal and formal. Brief letters focused mainly on legal matters related to restitution. But something had shifted during Vanessa's 3rd year in prison. Her letters became more reflective, less focused on her own suffering, and more concerned with understanding the impact of her crimes on others. The turning point came when she wrote to tell me about Maria Santos, an elderly woman serving time for welfare fraud who had become her cellmate. Maria's story, a desperate grandmother who had falsified documents to get medical care for her sick grandchild, had apparently forced Vanessa to confront the difference between crimes born of desperation and crimes of entitlement.
Maria helped me understand something I'd been avoiding, Vanessa had written. She showed me that there's a difference between making terrible choices because you're desperate to help someone you love and making terrible choices because you're desperate to maintain a lifestyle you can't afford. My crimes weren't about survival, they were about ego and appearances. This realization had led to what Derek described as a fundamental personality change. Vanessa had begun using her legal knowledge to help other inmates navigate the appeals process, but she'd also started teaching literacy classes and organizing discussion groups about financial responsibility and ethical decision-making. "She's become someone I recognize again," Derek had told me during one of our quarterly phone calls. "Not the person she was before the crimes, someone better, someone who understands the weight of her choices and is trying to build something meaningful from the wreckage." Derek himself had undergone his own transformation. After losing his medical practice and declaring bankruptcy, he'd taken a position with Doctors Without Borders, spending months at a time providing medical care in underserved communities. The work paid far less than his previous neurosurgery practice, but he'd found a sense of purpose that his previous lifestyle had lacked. "Losing everything material taught me what actually matters," he'd explained during one of his brief visits back to the States. "When you're treating patients who have nothing but are grateful for basic medical care, it puts your own losses in perspective." The most unexpected development had come just 6 months ago when Vanessa's case was featured in a Harvard Law Review article about the need for stronger ethical oversight in estate planning. The article, written by Professor Elizabeth Warren's research team, used Vanessa's crimes as a case study for proposed federal legislation that would require additional safeguards for wills created within 30 days of a person's death. The proposed legislation, nicknamed the Eleanor Whitman Protection Act by advocacy groups, would mandate cooling-off periods for substantial will changes involving elderly or medically compromised individuals. It would also require additional witness verification and medical capacity assessments for end-of-life estate modifications. My mother, who had maintained complete professional silence about Vanessa's case for years, had finally agreed to testify before a Senate subcommittee about the legislation. Her testimony, delivered with characteristic precision and emotional restraint, focused on the systemic vulnerabilities that allowed sophisticated criminals to exploit both elderly victims and the legal professionals who should protect them. "The legal system depends on trust," she'd told the senators. "When that trust is betrayed by someone with insider knowledge and professional credentials, it undermines the entire framework of estate protection. We need stronger safeguards, not just to prevent crimes like these, but to restore public confidence in the institutions designed to protect vulnerable populations." The legislation was still working its way through Congress, but it had already prompted changes in how many law firms handle estate planning for elderly clients. Several states had implemented their own versions of the proposed federal requirements, creating additional layers of protection for seniors making end-of-life financial decisions. Meanwhile, my documentary work had expanded beyond that first film about Vermont elders. I produced a 3-part series called Stolen Legacies that examined financial exploitation cases across the country. The series had aired on PBS and had been used as training material by law enforcement agencies and adult protective services organizations. The success of the documentary series had led to opportunities I'd never imagined. Last year, I'd been invited to consult on a Hollywood feature film about elder abuse, helping ensure that the portrayal of financial exploitation was both accurate and respectful to real victims. The experience had been surreal. sitting in script meetings discussing plot points that mirrored my own family's trauma, but with the satisfaction of knowing the film might educate audiences about these often hidden crimes. But perhaps the most meaningful project had been Letters from Inside, a short documentary I'd created about Vanessa's correspondence with crime victims' families. With permission from both Vanessa and several victim families, I'd been able to explore the complex process of accountability and forgiveness from multiple perspectives. The film featured interviews with Harold Brennan's daughter Helen, who had eventually agreed to correspond with Vanessa about her father's final months. Their exchange of letters had provided Helen with closure about her father's confused state during his last weeks, while giving Vanessa insight into the human cost of her manipulations. I needed to understand who my father really was in those final days, Helen had explained during filming. Vanessa's letters helped me piece together his mental state and realize that his confusion made him vulnerable, not complicit. That understanding gave me back my memories of him as a loving, rational man who was victimized, not someone who had suddenly stopped caring about his family. The documentary had also included segments about Margaret Stokes' nephew Thomas, who had found a different path to healing. Rather than corresponding with Vanessa, Thomas had channeled his anger into becoming an expert in financial exploitation cases, helping dozens of other families recover stolen assets and hold perpetrators accountable. Everyone heals differently, Thomas had said during his interview. Some people need direct contact with the person who hurt them. I needed to turn my experience into action that prevents other families from going through what we went through. As I reflected on these developments during the symposium, I realized that Eleanor's inheritance had ultimately created something far more valuable than the money or property Vanessa had tried to steal. It had generated a network of advocates, professionals, and reformed individuals working to protect vulnerable people from exploitation. The symposium concluded with a panel discussion about future directions in elder protection. As I sat with Amanda Chen, Professor Morrison, and several other experts, I found myself thinking about how Eleanor would have viewed all these developments. She'd always believed that good could emerge from even the most difficult circumstances if people were willing to learn from their experiences and use that knowledge to help others. The fact that her death had indirectly led to legal reforms, career changes, and countless hours of advocacy work would have pleased her far more than simply knowing her will had been properly executed. During the closing reception, I received a text message from Derek. He was calling from a refugee camp in Jordan where he was providing medical care to displaced families. The message included a photo of him with a group of children and a brief note. Vanessa asked me to tell you that the Eleanor Whitman Protection Act passed committee today. She's proud that something positive came from her mistakes. Later that evening, back in Eleanor's house, my house now, I sat in the room where I'd first discovered her journal entries about Vanessa's suspicious behavior. The space had been transformed into my editing studio, where I'd spent countless hours crafting documentaries about elder advocacy and financial protection.
On my desk was a letter that had arrived that morning from the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Vanessa would be eligible for early release in 18 months, based on her participation in victim restitution efforts and her work helping other inmates with legal appeals. The letter included a recommendation from the prison warden describing Vanessa as a model inmate who has demonstrated genuine rehabilitation and a commitment to using her legal expertise for positive purposes. I wasn't sure how I felt about the possibility of Vanessa's early release. Part of me believed she deserved to serve her full sentence, while another part recognized that she seemed to have undergone genuine transformation during her incarceration. The question was whether that transformation would survive contact with the outside world and all its temptations. But as I sat surrounded by the fruits of Eleanor's true legacy, the films, the advocacy work, the legal reforms, the transformed lives, I realized that Vanessa's redemption, or lack thereof, was ultimately her own responsibility. My job was to continue honoring Eleanor's memory by protecting vulnerable people and telling stories that mattered. Outside my window, the Vermont autumn was painting the maple trees in brilliant reds and golds, just as it had during my childhood visits to this house. Eleanor's garden, which I'd learned to maintain over the past 5 years, was preparing for winter with the same quiet dignity she'd shown in her final months. Tomorrow, I will begin editing a new documentary about adult children who have successfully protected their elderly parents from financial scams. It was a story of prevention rather than recovery, hope rather than loss. Eleanor would have approved. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.